When I went to college here in Washington at Georgetown, I used to come into this Capitol building and sit up there where our visitors are now sitting and watch what was going on the Senate floor. I can remember so many things, particularly the day that Bobby Kennedy gave a speech about Vietnam that was highly anticipated. He came walking through that door with his brother, Ted Kennedy, both of them senators, one from New York, the other from Massachusetts. It was a historic moment. It was a magic moment. For a college student, it was just overwhelming to be a witness to that history and to realize what this chamber has meant to this nation, what this building has meant to this nation throughout our history. That's why I'll never forget what happened in this chamber on January 6th, 2021. Violent extremists stormed the Capitol to prevent certification of the 2020 presidential election. Donald Trump was engaged in the big lie. For the first time, really, in the history of the United States, he questioned the legal outcome of an election. Madam President, you and I both know that is fundamental to a democracy, the belief that we can have the peaceful transition of the decision makers guided by the people of this country without political interference. As insurrectionists ransacked this building, many carried flags and banners to show their support for former President Trump in his effort to overturn the election, the big lie. Two of the more prominent symbols of the so-called Stop the Steal campaign on behalf of President Trump were on display that day. One was an American flag flown upside down, and the other a so-called Appeal to Heaven flag. While the events of January 6th were hard to imagine, reports that these same battle flags flew outside the Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito's home were nearly as shocking. In January 2021, less than 2 weeks after the insurrection at the Capitol, an upside-down American flag flew over Justice Alito's front lawn in suburban Virginia. In the summer of 2023, the Appeal to Heaven flag flew on the flagpole of the Alito's beach home in New Jersey. While these flags may have once held other meanings, in the year 2021, they were closely associated with election deniers and extreme right-wing politicians. They are, in fact, the battle flags of Trump's MAGA movement. The Supreme Court's authority, Madam President, ultimately rests on its reputation and public confidence. The Supreme Court doesn't own an army. It doesn't have a vast treasury. It depends on people trusting the justices to make honest, professional decisions. This reputation and public confidence is the strength of the Supreme Court. That is why the Supreme Court's recently adopted Code of Conduct requires justices to avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. And both the Code of Conduct and federal law require justices to recuse themselves when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The flying of these flags marks a new, disturbing chapter in the Supreme Court's ongoing ethical crisis. It suggests that Justice Alito has not only chosen sides in an ongoing political dispute, but he's also announced his allegiance in pending legal disputes. As we speak, the Supreme Court is considering two critical cases relating to the 2020 presidential election and the January 6th insurrection. In Trump versus the United States, the Supreme Court will decide whether former President Trump is immune from criminal prosecution for his efforts to overturn the election. And in Fisher versus the United States, the Supreme Court, will determine whether the federal felony obstruction statute applies to the January 6 rioters who tried to stop Congress from exercising its constitutional duty to certify the election. The court's ruling on these issues will be critical to ensuring that those responsible for one of the darkest chapters in our history are held accountable. But displaying the upside-down American flag and Appeal to Heaven flag creates the appearance that Justice Alito has already aligned himself with the Stop the Steal campaign. He cannot credibly claim to be an umpire calling balls and strikes in these cases. He has donned the jersey of his favorite team. That's why I called on Justice Alito to recuse himself, and why I urge Chief Justice Roberts to finally step up and take the steps necessary to ensure that Justice Alito does not sit on those cases, and rather that he recuse himself. Last week, Justice Alito refused my request. I'm going to keep this letter. The original version was sent to me and to Senator Whitehouse by Justice Alito, in which he makes an argument that these flags should not be taken seriously, that it was his wife's decision. There were complications in her decision. It's hard to accept this. It's hard first to believe that this man whom we're asking to recuse himself from these Supreme Court cases has somehow stood in judgment of himself and decided that he did nothing unethical and should not recuse himself. He refused our request to come before the committee and refused our request to recuse himself from these cases. In doing so, he claimed he bears no responsibility for the January 6th related flags flying over his homes. Instead, he placed the blame solely on his wife. He went on to downplay the significance of the upside-down American flag display, claiming it was part of a dispute with his neighbors. And he denied knowing about the connection between the Appeal to Heaven flag and the January 6th insurrection in the Capitol. Chief Justice Roberts likewise refused my request to take action and simply deferred to Justice Alito's decision. But Justice Alito's refusal to recuse begs the question, why should he have the sole power to decide whether his recusal from the case is necessary? Additional reporting has also already called into question his version of events, with text messages and even a recording of a call to police suggesting the neighborhood dispute occurred after the upside-down American flag flew over the Alito residence. And whether Justice Alito raised these flags himself or stood idly by while his wife did so, the fact remains the same. A reasonable person would question Justice Alito's impartiality to cases relating to the 2020 election, and January 6th recusal is therefore necessary. But the consequences of Justice Alito's actions go far beyond this. He needs to recuse himself from these cases. By displaying two symbols of the MAGA Republican movement, Justice Alito presented himself to the world as a political actor and an ally of the far right. His actions suggest that no matter what arguments are made or what evidence is presented at the Supreme Court, his decisions will align with his personal beliefs and policy preferences. And no matter what excuses or explanations he provides, now or in the future, it will be hard for anybody before the court to believe that Justice Alito approaches their case without bias. We cannot afford further erosion of public confidence in our courts. Our faith in the impartiality of judges is essential to the functioning of our legal system and our democratic form of government. For more than a year, story after story has broken about ethical misconduct by the sitting justices of the Supreme Court. We've learned that some justices, including Justice Alito again, accepted gifts and travel from billionaires with interest before the court. The Senate and the American people deserve to know the full extent of how immense wealth is used to buy private access to the justices. That's why the Senate Judiciary Committee is exercising its constitutional authority to investigate what has been provided to the justices. And I will continue to push for legislation, a bill sponsored primarily by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, but many of us have joined as co-sponsors, to establish a binding code of conduct and recusal standards for the justices. Why in the world should the highest court in our land have the lowest standard of ethics? If every other federal judge is held to a standard of ethics to make certain that their reputation is intact, why would that not apply to the justices sitting on the highest court of the land? We'll continue to push for legislation to create a binding code of conduct and recusal standards that the American people can see. Last year, the Judiciary Committee reported to the floor the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act. Importantly, this legislation's ethical and recusal requirement would apply equally to every justice of the Supreme Court, regardless of the party of the president who appointed them. The Supreme Court has failed to act to address the ethical crisis that has engulfed it, and the Senate must do so. Madam President, there's a simple fact. There is a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. It is within his power to resolve this ethical issue tonight, to have it done by the morning, to make it clear that the Supreme Court is taking a different course, one that is credible to the American people. Justice Alito cannot stand in judgment of himself. The fact that we have to come to the floor of the Senate to plead this case makes it clear that there are no avenues to be followed for ethical consideration before the court today. That can change. The bill that is pending on the calendar is a step in the right direction, and I totally support it. I close by asking unanimous consent that the letter sent to me by Justice Alito be part of the congressional record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.